Hello, Internet. Welcome to another episode of the Ideas About God podcast. My name is Josh. I am one of your hosts.
And my name is Fabian. I'm the other host. Ideas About God is a podcast where we talk about life, pop culture, theology, all with the hope of making ideas about God interesting, fun, applicable, whatever, helpful for your life. It's just two dudes talking about theology, and you get to be in on the conversation. So hopefully as we have fun, you're having fun. So would you please, really quick, before you continue, hit the plus button or follow wherever you're listening. Give us a review as well. Help other people find this. Yes. And yeah, so thank you so much for doing that. We always appreciate the follows.
And also find us on Instagram. We have an Instagram page. Find us on there. We post short clips of our stuff on Instagram. So give us a follow on there. That's a pretty easy way to keep track of what we're doing.
Yeah, so, and to share it with your friends. Because we try to post like good highlights.
We try to. Yeah.
Good, I don't know. Yeah.
Yeah. I was like, what do we have plugged out of our socials? Like,
I know. We got to plug the
that?
socials. Yeah, we sometimes post on YouTube if the camera doesn't die on us. So we'll see what happens this week. But yeah. So we are continuing in this episode a series that we started last week where we're talking about process theology. And we're going to be talking about classical theism.
Yes.
So Josh is going to start us off by telling us what the fuck that means.
What the fuck that means, right? Okay. All right. So in order to understand classical theism, we kind of first have to understand where that idea kind of comes from, at least as far as a Christian understanding of it is. And this is also mine. And from my research and my understanding, this may not be true if someone was hold on to like classical theistic ideas. I don't think that's exclusive to like the Christian tradition. I imagine other religions may hold to some of these classical theistic ideas. So bear all that with a grain of salt. All right. So with that being
very Western,
Western
understandings of God. So this is if you're on the eastern side of the world, like whatever.
You may not. You're going to be like, no, we don't believe any.
What
of
does even eastern side of the world mean? Because it's like a globe.
It's a globe.
I don't know.
Well, you know the answer to that.
Yeah.
Colonialism.
Yes. Okay. Yeah. True. Yeah.
Yeah. All right. So, I guess I got one thing. We haven't really defined what classical theism is. Like some of the tenets of classical theism. We're like, here's the story, and then we have this really great conversation, and I'm like, I don't think we said anything about omnipotence. So. Yeah, we should probably do that. Okay. So there's some.
Let's define it.
Okay, so when we talk about classical theism, right? We have like here's this journey went on. Some of the main things that hold up is one, God is immutable, so God does not change. God is the one. Like to go back to Aquinas, God, the uncaused cause. We can also say like the unmoved mover, right? The one who is like unchanged by the world, but is in process of changing the world. So God is immutable. We have God is omnipotent. God is all powerful. So this God can control the universe. And then we have like different like schools of thought as to where like how God does that. Yeah. Or does God do that? Does God like sometimes control the universe and then take God's hands off, or does God like is God involved in like constant like even down to like keeping electrons like whirling around atoms like how does that work? I don't know. Like God intimately involved in that.
Does God control the probability?
Does God control probability waves? I don't know. Oh yeah. So like we have omnipotent, but however you define it, like a classical theism would hold on to at least some form of God's omnipotence. We have God's omniscience, meaning that God knows everything. We have, and finally, God's omnipresence. I think it'll be the last one. God's omnipresence, meaning God is everywhere. You cannot go in a place where God is not also there. Yeah, those are some of the main tenets of classical theism. I think I got them all. Was I missing anything?
No, I think you got them.
Okay, so before we get too far into it, we first need to understand kind of the where Christianity comes from. In order to understand that, we have to understand ancient Judaism. So Judaism initially started off, when we look at the text, we look at the Hebrew Bible. We see that the ancient Hebrews were not truly like monotheistic in the sense of like they only believed in one God.
Yeah.
They would have said there are many gods. However, ours is the best one, right?
Yeah.
The one they called Yahweh. And it was pretty common to believe like, oh yeah, our tribe has our God. Like the Babylonians, they have Baal. Whoever has different tribes have different deities. And so so when you went to war, it was very common to also be imagining like your gods fighting each other. And so like when you won, it was because your God defeated their God.
Yeah.
And it's a way of showing like, oh, like not only are we powerful as an army, like our God is also powerful, and they're also kind of giving us sort of divine energy, to, like that's why we won. So like that's kind of the cultural that grew up in, like that the ancient Hebrews kind of swam in, and you see in glimpses of that in the text, even now, like they kind of like show up in weird ways. You have a few Psalms where the psalmist is talking about like, when is Yahweh going to like help us? And like they're describing like a council of these divine deities, as if like all the deities from all local tribes like met together on like a council, like some sort of like the UN or something like that.
Yeah.
I don't know. Have you seen like the most recent like Love and Thunder movie?
No.
Where like so all the gods from like everywhere are
Yeah.
all together, and then like there's Zeus, and then there's Thor, and then one of them makes this where it's like, oh, there's that weird god of carpentry over there, and like you kind of think like, are they making reference to Jesus? I don't know. That'd be silly.
It kind of makes me think of the Santa Claus. I think it was the Santa Claus 3 or the Santa Claus 2 Santa Claus 2 where there was like the council of all the characters from the different holidays.
Yes, it's like that,
yeah,
but with deities.
The Molinator. and whatever, like Father Time is just like passed out on the desk, like not even paying attention. Like, why are you there, dude?
Yeah, well, he's tired. Yeah, so it kind of, in a sense, they may have conceived that's what the heavens were like. So eventually, over time, and probably as they came into contact with other religious groups like Zoroastrianism, they were also monotheistic. Greeks had some monotheistic ideas. They probably like interacted, and you kind of like see this growing awareness because as you read the Hebrew Bible, I mean, it was written over the course of almost like 2,000 years. There's like this evolution in thought that not only is Yahweh like the main God or one of these gods, and all now is like this powerful God. It's like maybe Yahweh is the only God.
Yeah,
like all the other gods aren't powerful, they're not even real, and Yahweh is actually God of all. And that kind of shows up, especially in like some of the later prophets.
So I'm stealing this from a friend, Derek. He talked about how one of the things he learned in his religion undergrad is that there was this consolidation because Yahweh was the one that was this common God among these various tribes at this one time. And so I'm sure there's a lot of like speculation on kind of how did that happen. But yeah, sorry, that was got a little like flavor.
Yeah, and that wouldn't be uncommon for like because you'd have these like kind of like metropolitan centers where you would have lots of people from a lot of different backgrounds, tribes living together, mixing together, trading, bartering good. And so you're like, like I have my God, but also my friend down the street, that guy, like he has his gods, and they're probably cool. So like you kind of believe in all of them, but like your God is the main one, and so you kind of see like you have this.
But like your God has a 6-pack. So
Jack.
I kind of like that God, or like you have the other neighbor that's like, hey, we disagree on all these other things, but like we agree on this God. Yeah, we both have this God,
right? And so it's like
there's a commonality there.
And so like maybe some of them traveled better than others, and like were able to get picked up on for like different reasons, whatever. And so Yahweh ends up being like this one that kind of like everyone kind of glommed onto. And then we can talk about how ancient Israel formed, like the historical origins of that, but. Whatever. So anyway, then of course Jesus happens. Yeah. And that was at that time, like the Israelites would have probably defined themselves as we're pretty exclusively monotheistic at this time. Like I think Jesus would have been like, no, there's only one God, and that is Yahweh. Yeah. If you ask, do you believe in the gods of the Romans who he would have been in contact with, and he'd been like, no, like I don't. And so this happens, and then writers, the first writer being Paul, and some of the other Christians started writing, and as they were talking about their faith, they inevitably use language that they would have been comfortable with when they're talking about big things in life, right? And so Paul, being one who wrote a good chunk of the New Testament for Christians, was, trained. He was a learned fellow. He was a citizen of Rome. And so he probably knew some like Greek philosopher. He probably like would have been aware of who like the Cynics were. He would have known who Plato and Aristotle and all those guys were. And so we see him.
And a lot of time, like going to school would have been being trained under these philosophers, right? Because that was like the main discipline, maybe. I mean, obviously there were trades, I guess you could say, but in terms of the main discipline of academic variance, that would have been the main one of the day, right? Maybe some mathematics
and
as
he would
well.
have, I mean, Paul being a Pharisee would have also been, pretty heavily steeped in like, in his own like, Jewish roots, as being a Pharisee, he would have known his his culture that like his tradition that way. And so Paul begins to like pick up on some of these ideas of Platonism, of Plato and all that stuff, but it doesn't really come into its own in like Christian theology until we get to Augustine, and that was like 400-ish. And so we get to Augustine, and Augustine grew up in school. Like he studied under they call the Neoplatonists, which would have been I guess who were about 1,000-ish years after Plato. Some of these ideas were getting picked up and were like they started popularizing these ideas. And he studied under those folks. And then when he becomes a Christian, he sees, there's a lot of overlap between what I learned here and what I'm learning in my faith right now. And so to understand kind of like what some of these are, we need to talk about what Plato thought about the world. So Plato, and maybe some of you've heard this before, used this metaphor to describe reality. And he said, reality is like a cave, and we all live in this cave, and our backs are facing the wall away from the cave entrance. And so what we see is shadows of the real things passing by the front entrance of the cave, and we are just seeing shadows. Like all of everything we see is shadows. There is a real world that is real. We just can't get to it. It's kind of like the Matrix, right?
Yeah.
Like I don't know. Like I think like the Wachowskis kind of borrow a little bit from that to make the Matrix. Because the Wachowskis they're rad. And so like that's kind of like this idea, right? And so like he had this idea like, well, there's a real place. Like there's this idea of the forms, right? There is the form of the perfect dog exists in heaven, right?
Yeah.
There's the perfect horse exists in heaven. But all we have down here is cheap copies of it, right? So we kind of like created this like world where it's like there's like the ideal, the perfect, and there's the rest of us where we all live in, and it sucks.
Yeah.
And so kind of like created like this kind of dualism, and also like
this was all logic based, right?
Yes,
like this is based off logical proofs,
right?
Right. Which is connected to mathematics at the time, and so at this time the main discipline being philosophy and adjacent to that logic and adjacent to that math that defined a lot of how people understood the world,
right?
Versus like if we think about the history of what you talked about with the Israelites, a lot of how they understood quote unquote God was through storytelling, right? They shared these stories that were passed down and via oral tradition. And so they weren't sitting there and like, maybe they were, maybe that's just like, I don't know a lot of the history of this, but unlike someone like Plato and then Augustine going to this school where he's trained by Neoplatonists, they were telling these stories that connected them to their ancestors, that sort of helped them understand how and why things happen in the world, and they were passing those stories on to each other, but they weren't sitting there going like, okay, what are the theological ideas that we can extract from this to create this picture of who the deity is? It's like, no, the deity was the one that made sure that there was rain on my crops, right? So it's like,
right.
That's where you start moving away from sort of this oral tradition to this like academic version.
No, it was perfect, because I really think it helps like kind of outline what some of the driving motivations behind like this Greek philosophy was. Like it was very much like, oh, we were a lot logic based. Right? Like you read Plato's, and everything Plato wrote was in the form of dialogue. It was he would have Socrates, like being kind of like this person asking questions and then leading people in like this argument. And it's very much like, well, do you agree to this? And they would be like, okay, yes. And he's like, they would point out like why you should or why you shouldn't believe in this. And then he would build upon that like logical facts, like you have A, and then you have B, and then you have C. So obviously you have to accept D, and then yada yada yada. So like that's kind of how I put these things together. And so that's Plato, and then that got kind of tucked in under Augustine. And Augustine saw these as like, oh, these kind of things naturally overlap, at least in his experience. So that gets picked up as Augustine. Almost 1,000 years later, we have Thomas Aquinas, and Thomas Aquinas was also a big fan. He kind of went in and he did this sort of same thing, but with Aristotle. Yeah. And from Aristotle, Aristotle was like, Plato was very much like big into like the forms and things like that, like ideals. And then Aristotle is like, no, like we can look at the world around us and we can understand the world through like observation. Yeah. And we can study, like he's kind of more in the, like empiricism, kind of like
evidence,
and that was kind of like his primary way. When you go to Rome and you see, in the Vatican, or they have like the painting of all these philosophers, and in the centerpiece you have like Plato and Aristotle. And Plato is like pointing up at the sky, and Aristotle's next to him pointing down at the ground. And it's kind of their way of like pictorially showing you this debate happening between these two philosophers. Like they're not like at odds with each other, but they're like two different ways of kind of viewing the world. For Aquinas, one of the things he saw God as being like this, the first, like the first cause of everything, right? So there's this idea of like, oh, like something happens because it has a cause, right? There's a cause and there's an effect. And his idea was like, well, if you go back far enough, eventually you run into something where like, oh, like nothing caused this. And he called that thing God, right? So this idea is like God is the uncaused cause, the God who like who kicks off all this. And so really what we're seeing is like so much of this is logic and reason based, and like really it's just picking up a lot of this Greek ideas. And that's fine and it works until it kind of doesn't. Yeah. So and so, of course, like bringing all these, like all this, like thinking and empiricism and all that sort of stuff, like really is great because it kicks off things like, the Renaissance, and allows us to discover, like understand like science, come with the scientific method, and how do we know what we know about the world, and how can we do that. We can do incredible things that we can make penicillin, and we can, figure out how planets work and all this stuff. And what starts to happen is we run into like this space where it used to be like, why did the rains come? Well, it's because a divine deity made it happen. We were, the gods wanted it to. And now we're like, oh no, it happened because, we have the water cycle. We understand like there's like a pattern to this, and like, weather does what weather does, and we can understand it. Why lightning happened? It used to be like Zeus threw it. And it's like, no, lightning is because like that was the tallest object, and there was an overabundance of like positive charge, and there's some negative charge in the clouds, and that's how it works. Yeah. And so like, it seemed like the space where you could put God got smaller and smaller and smaller. So eventually, like, do you even need God? Yeah. Right. So like this God of classical theism that's done such a good job of marrying itself and wedding itself to like reason and science, like wrote itself out of the picture. It ended up like just like having to like recede out of the picture. And that's why you can have like, there are entirely perfectly naturalistic ways of looking at the world, and you're like, you don't need God, right? Because you like classical theism, I think, kind of ran got to the end of the runway, and just kind of kept going, and like, all right, that's okay. Yeah.
And the point of what you're describing is, there's one way to think about this, and this is kind of what I grew up with. The story that the way that we have come to understand God is how God has disclosed God's self to us throughout history, right? So we know God is like this, right? Because God has shown us that God is like that. And so maybe there were these multiple gods that the Israelites believed in or had images of in their homes or whatever, like, whatever. But God said, no, I'm the only God, and all those other gods are idols. And so, okay, God's self-disclosing, God's the only God.
Right.
And okay, God is self-disclosing that God is all powerful and all-knowing. And in reality, the other way you could view this, which is probably the more true way, I don't want to limit the possibility that God self-discloses, I guess.
Right,
I mean,
right.
if you think about process theology, we do say like God
Yeah.
is immanent, and so God is present and doing things and inviting. But the other way to view it is that as we've discovered more about this creation, that we've taken those ideas that have helped us understand creation more to apply them to how we understand God.
Right.
And so study of the world has influenced how we've understood God, rather than this like self-disclosure that God is telling us, okay, this is how I am.
Right.
Instead, it's this other thing. Like we have to acknowledge
Yeah.
that.
And that's not a bad thing, right? So
I know it's not a bad thing.
Yeah, because like I know growing up, like if you were to point out the very human and natural way in which religions form, and in the way in which like these sorts of things happen, like if you talk about like the very human origins of the Bible, where like this was a long process, like that can like set some folks on edge because you're like, oh shoot, like this thing that I thought was like this divine thing that fell out of this divine revelation that fell out of the heavens, perfect, and like that's bad. But then you like and you point out like, oh, like no, like it's very human, and it was like a process, and it's messy, and like that can be really jarring at first. And like, but it's true. Like Augustine was just doing his best, right? He had some experience and he's like, I have this knowledge and I'm like, these things seem like they're lining up. And it was popular. Like this stuff caught on. People liked it and it kept and it spread and people found it helpful. And then things are helpful until
there's a reason why we still talk about him today and his writings, and why if you go to seminary you read some of his stuff. You read Aquinas, like natural law. That's one thing that I will never forget about Aquinas is that he talked about how like ethics aren't something that come from necessarily from the divine. Like ethics are sort of baked into existence itself. Like there are these things that you don't do because it's right and wrong. Right. And I like that. I find the idea of natural law helpful. So it's not to disparage these people and say like, oh, we're superior because we're more knowledgeable about. It's more to say, as you experience life and you have the collective wisdom of humanity, you expand your understanding of things. Like we know how to create cars now, right? And build iPhones because we've built upon the past, right? Why don't we do that with God? Like, why? The reason we say classical like theism is because we've left our understanding of God frozen in some like the 1700s moment. Why did we do that? Why haven't we known more about God? And isn't that what it means to be in a relationship with God? Right. To know more about God. So that's It
echoes how like we were talking earlier, it kind of echoes how I personally came into process theism is because I ran into the end of where classical theism could take me, and I had questions that it wasn't going to answer, at least not in a way that I was like satisfied with. Like I was like, that sucks. I can't believe in that. And so that's what led me to the new thing. And odds are like, hopefully like 500 years from now, like someone comes along and using whatever new insights have been gained by science and philosophy and culture, like we'll come up with new ways of thinking about God. Because like humans, we have been having religious experiences since probably before we were humans. Like we've been doing this for a very long time. And we have always found ways to talk about them in ways that are meaningful, try to talk about the biggest questions in life. And we do it using whatever is around us, whether that is our oral storytelling tradition and the stories have been handed to us, or whether it is gleaning insights from philosophy, whether it's gaining insights from the like science or art, whatever, we take all that into us, and then we use that as a lens to which to understand. We it's like we touch the infinite, and they're like, we need language to talk about this, and so this is what we have. And we're always like, I think the problem comes when we assume that the language about the experience is the experience. Is the experience.
Yeah.
And the reality is like, no, like it's just language about the experience. Like, telling someone how great it feels, like what it's like to fall in love, is not the same thing as falling in love, right? Telling someone about your partner is not the same thing as experiencing like, intimacy and being with them, like it's not the same.
It's almost like the experience that we have of God, the divine, the sacred today. I can say I've had that experience, those experiences where I can name certain parts in my life where I'm like, I experienced something profound that I cannot shake.
Yeah.
That's just there. That moved me and changed me. And I'm grateful for it because it did something within me and allowed me to see the world in a different way. That experience is similar to whatever it was that motivated, led, inspired Moses to set a bunch of people free. Now, like, was it the literal burning bush and a voice coming out of that bush that is God? Like, is that the capturing of God, or is this experience that the text can't even fully describe that this person named Moses had, the thing that we can call God? We get stuck on that. That's kind of what classical theology is like. It's like saying, well, that bush is God, and that we're just going to stop there. Right? Like it's not anything else. It's not the bush next to it. No. It's that bush.
That bush.
That is God.
It's the one.
And that's it. We've closed it off. Now we're going to build a shrine to this bush.
Right.
And we're going to worship this bush. And now for the rest of eternity, or whatever, like the rest of human existence, our kids afterwards, we're just like, this bush is God. Yeah. And it's like, no, we can't stop there.
Right.
Because then you have Jesus. And Jesus shows up and does all these things, and you're like, oh my gosh, this person is God.
Right.
And Jesus says that. But then, Jesus leaves, and it's like, well, okay, is God this like building that is ornate and beautifully painted by probably slaves that weren't paid very much? Or whatever. I don't know how some of those, really nice like old churches were built. Yeah. Is that God?
Yeah.
Or do we have a bigger picture of what God is? And I think that's kind of the idea of what we're trying to get across. It's like the theories the theories stop working at some point. And for you, your story is that the idea that God is all powerful didn't work anymore.
Right. Yeah. That's pretty much it.
And if we go back to thinking about, we came to understand God with all those omnis, we realized that some of those things were the things that were important to them at the time. Right? So like God is all-knowing, omniscient, is because they were trying to know. They were like trying to know things that were unknowable. And so we value a God that would know all things, because that is the ideal, to whole Plato's thing. Like, okay, there's this ideal that exists outside of the messy reality, and that is perfect, and that ideal knows all things.
Yes.
Or we want to be powerful because my daughter is dying of a disease that I don't understand. Well, at least there's this ideal beyond, outside of this experience, where God is all powerful and can control all things, and so, but I can't control what's happening in this situation. And so it's almost like the thing that we want is the omnis that we've placed on God as well.
And this is I think this kind of lead us into a conversation. I think about like I think the hang-ups with classical theism, right? So one, we have the issue where just kind of like, it seems like we just kind of ran out of it from like a scientific perspective. But I think another one is all of these terms are really good. Like imagine if you are a dictator and someone gave you all of these titles, like you feel pretty damn good about yourself, right? So why are we describing God using language that would flatter like Emperor Nero? Right? Why are we doing that? Right? So you can see how like this language is also very much tied up in language of hierarchy. Yeah. And I'm not saying like, well, no, I am saying hierarchy is necessarily bad. But that's my own personal thing. I think this kind of gives rise to a sense of like, oh, things are the way they are because that's how God wants them to be. Yeah. Thomas Aquinas talks about like there being a great chain of being. God is at the top, and then underneath them are angels, and underneath it, like somewhere there are humans, and farther down there's trees, and then somewhere down there's rocks, and then at the bottom, or I don't know, whatever's at the bottom. Yeah. And it kind of gives a way of seeing the universe as all things like have to be subservient to the things above them. Yeah. And it allows hierarchies that we find in culture to now just get like a divine stamp of approval, right? So like, yes, I am a white, wealthy, I don't know, slave owner, and I'm this way because God wants it to be that way, right? God wants this, right? There's like command, like God's up here, and then I'm down here, and then all of you, my slaves. I don't want to be this way. Like, I'm sorry. Like, like no, like,
and God is omnipotent, so God set this up.
God set this up. Yeah, I can't help it.
Like, I was just, why? There's no complaining here. Like, it's God's design.
Yeah, I mean, and the truth is
not my own greed.
It's not. It certainly isn't. And the thing is, these are actual arguments that were used to keep like chattel slavery as a thing, right? And these are arguments that have been used to hold up systems of oppression that have been in place like for a long time. So there's this idea of, no, God wants it to be this way because there's a hierarchy in the universe and God's on top of it. Mm-hmm. So yeah, I find that troubling. Another one is this idea of like, what do we do with evil? Yeah. Right. So you get like, the classic thing is the theodicy. Yeah. This idea of, okay, we have a God who's all good. Oh, that's another omni. All loving. Right? All loving, yeah. Omnibenevolent. Yeah. There's God who is like all loving and omnibenevolent and is always looking for the best, looking out for the best. We also have this God who's all powerful, and yet why is there suffering in the world? So wouldn't an all loving God want to get rid of suffering? Yeah. And why doesn't that all-loving and all-powerful God do that? Yeah. And so the question is like, well, usually at some point they go around to defining like, oh, like suffering is like, well, just, that's what God wanted. So okay, so God is really God.
There's an end. There's some sort of like end goal that God is causing the suffering for. That's one way to think about it.
And so God wants this to happen, which in this case is, I mean, it feels really bad. Yeah. Like what was the end that God was searching for? And like, I don't know. Like, imagine every terrible thing that's happened and be like, oh yeah, there's a bit of like.
Or another response is that people will have is like, God just lets certain things happen. Yeah. Which then the question is like, well, why would God let certain things happen and other things not happen? Like, why would 20 people be praying for this one lady to be healed from cancer, and God does a miracle and heals her from cancer, but not this other person who has 30 people praying for her to be healed from cancer in an exact similar situation? Yep. Why one and not the other?
Right. Yeah. And it's like we kind of let God be like, yeah, there's a lot of terrible things are happening in the world. And this all powerful, all loving God, we just like let him off the hook. Yeah. Like, why are we holding God to a higher standard than like what I would hold like a babysitter to? You know, like if I had if I heard, I don't have children, but I imagine if I had children, if a babysitter was watching them and they're like, well, I couldn't impinge on their freedom, so they just crawled out. Like, yo, like, what are you doing? Don't do that. Like that's bad, right? So why are we giving letting God like have the same kind of like why are we not taking God to task over that? Yeah. And that's where I'm like, oh yeah, so I don't like that's the Odyssey, and I think the classical theism does not handle that question
Yeah.
anywhere near satisfactorily for me.
Uh-uh.
Like, I don't find it helpful. And maybe if someone does, that's cool. But I'm like, for me, I'm like, no, I can't.
Yeah, I would say if you find it satisfactory, then you're just avoiding the real depth of, and that's probably a harsh way to say it, but it's just the reality. You're avoiding the real depth of pain and suffering.
Yeah.
Because you can't reconcile. I say can't as in it's not possible,
right,
in my mind, to reconcile the Holocaust and an all-loving, all-powerful God. Yeah. That's millions and millions of people dying horrible deaths, and
because God wanted it, or
because God,
sort of
there's
plan.
There's no way to reconcile, or because God just let it happen. No, an all-loving God would say, "Yeah, Hitler, you're done.
Yeah,
you're done.
Right?
We're just gonna end this." So yeah, so I would say honestly that's a pretty good place to stop, unless you had anything else. I got
nothing.
We're gonna leave you with a little cliffhanger here, because then you're gonna like, okay, what is process theology?
Yes,
we've talked about it a few times, and so I feel like people.
I'm just gonna jump in.
If you've listened to the other episodes, you'll get the
hopefully so.
So the context clues of where we're going, but we'll leave it at that. So let's go to our hype zone. What's hyping you up?
What is hyping me up? Okay, so I bought a new board game.
Oh yeah.
So we should
I'm
meet
excited.
out.
Yes.
Okay, so
I'm all
the board
down for new board games.
Okay, so the board game is called Ahoy.
Oh.
And is
Ahoy?
Ahoy, like a pirate, like ahoy.
Ahoy.
Yeah.
I'm ready.
Yeah. It's
that was so bad.
It's great. It's made by this company called Leader Games, and all of their games, like the artists they hire to do the artwork, is incredible. It's whimsical. It's like whimsy, but like usually, and their games also are they have a tendency to be very they're usually all asymmetric, meaning like each character, like it's like a chess game is fairly symmetrical. You like everybody has the same pieces. The only thing is like one person moves first, but for the most part, it's symmetrical. An asymmetric game is a game where like you different players all have different things going on. Like so like it's like football would be considered asymmetrical football because one team is on offense and the other team is on defense, right? Yeah. An asymmetrical board game, like they might either be trying to achieve like the same goal but doing it different ways, or maybe this one has powers and this one has different powers. Kind of like that. So all their games kind of like play in this asymmetry, and seeing these interactions. And also a lot of their games like encourage really interesting like social interactions to make this work. They have this one game called Oath, which is really cool.
Cool. I like that.
So Ahoy is like you have like these two different pirate factions and they're like going to war with each other. And then you have like two other players.
Is this all on the seas?
Yeah. So you're building this ocean up. And so like you're making the ocean as you explore more and finding islands. And then you have these two other pirate like folks who aren't part of the army or the navies, and they're just like they're smugglers. And so they're running back and forth smuggling goods. And then whenever they make a delivery, like, oh, like that island is now worth more.
Oh yeah.
And so like what is worth what on places on the map is constantly changing based on how these people. And then also like whenever you make a delivery, like you get a basically kind of bet on like whoever, like, cause you end up forming relationships with the two different pirate factions, because you're like, hey, you do this for me, and also like I need you to hold this land because if you do, I can get a crap ton of points at the end. And so like you're playing this game too, and you're kind of like involved in like running guns for a pirate war. Yeah. It's cool. Like awesome. and then the art is just adorable because you have you have these crabs and sharks. it's rad. It's Ahoy. That's what's hyped me up. I'm really pumped to get on the table sometime.
Yeah. Okay. That's super cool. What's hyping me up is I am almost done with the 4th season of Handmaid's Tale.
Yeah.
Going into the 5th season. And I think we could do a whole series of episodes, like multiple episodes on just so many different things in this show.
You want to talk about Christian nationalism for a month?
Yeah. We could talk about Christian nationalism. We could talk about reproduction and reproductive rights, which is under the heading of Christian nationalism. Like we could talk about things like
purity culture.
Yeah, purity culture. Ooh. We could talk. There's the nature of trauma.
Yeah.
Like that's the thing that we're getting into in sort of the end of season 4 is the nature of trauma. There's patriarchy, which is under the heading of Christian nationalism. There's all these things. And another one, Christian nationalism, the idea that like a lot of the people that, at least in the show, and I'm not going to spoil too much by saying this, but
right.
They admit, and this is probably the show writers just like naming things that are happening in our culture, but they admit that it's not because they actually believe a lot of these things, but it's because of power.
Yeah.
And so you think about what's happening now with a lot of people. Do these people actually believe what they're saying, or are they saying these things and creating these laws and doing all these things because adjacent to this quote unquote religious mandate that they have to put these laws in place, it's giving them more and more power.
Yeah.
And so that's actually the more important thing. So there's so much. I feel like, I'm just like, this show lends itself to so much theological talk. And so, but it's not just for the podcast, just for my own self. I'm like very drawn into this show.
Yeah. It'd be really cool to get guests on, and we can talk about we're going to talk about Christian nationalism in light of that, and we have a guest to talk about that. Oh,
yes, yeah. So that's jazzing me up. I'm like, any chance I get, I'm hopping on to the Hulu app and just watching because
nice.
I'm like, I have to. But yeah, that's what's hyping us up.
Awesome, cool.
All
right. That's a sode.
We
did it.
Yeah,
good job.
Well, yeah.
Cool.
Good job to you. Well, thank you so much for watching, and we'll see you on the next one.
Thanks.
Bye.